Okay, I think we're live. And today I just wanted to go over Surah 33, the allies. Now, the name of this Surah derives from the Battle of the Trench, where a collection of Arab tribes allied with one another in order to try to defeat Muhammad and his followers. And they were defeated, and this is used as an emblem of Islamic of the divinity of the Quran, and the fact that Allah is the true God, the fact that they won this battle in which they were not favored to win. And this is a recurring theme in the Quran. In the Quran, Allah does not perform a single miracle. There are no signs or wonders. All of unless you consider the miracles that are performed in the Bible to be miracles done by Allah. Now, of course, in the Bible, when Jehovah or when Yahweh performs a miracle, when he led Moses and the nation of Israel out of captivity in Egypt, and he supplied them with food in the wilderness, and when he led them into Canaan, and they emerged victorious over all of these nations that were superior to them in many ways. That was the God of Abraham. The same way, it wasn't the Muslim God. So if you're going to attribute these miracles to Allah, you could just as soon attribute them to Thor or Zeus or or Ra, the sun god. God, you could attribute it to virtually anything. In the same way that Mormons will will, will retcon the miracles of the Bible to Joseph Smith, and then add their their bizarre beliefs that have no verification outside of Mormonism, and say, "Wow, this is proof that the Book of Mormon it really is part of progressive revelation." And logically, it doesn't hold up. So, if you eliminate all of the parts, the fragments of the Bible that Muhammad plagiarized, if you put that aside, in the Quran, there are no miracles. There's a legend surrounding. There are legends that Arabian legends surrounding ancient an ancient southern Arabian tribe, Ad and Thamud. And again, this is simply Muhammad claiming credit for for a legend that predated Islam itself. So apart from that, there are no miracles in the Quran. Allah does not perform any miracles, no signs and wonders. And the only evidence of Allah being the true God and Muhammad being an apostle of Allah, an apostle of God, are these military victories. The fact that a numerically weak, very unimpressive band of nomadic warriors was able to overcome the Quraysh and Jewish tribes like the Abu Nadir and Banu Nadir and the Banu Qurayza, and was able to defeat all of these tribes, and by the end of Muhammad's life, conquer most of the Arabian Peninsula. So these military victories are the only tangible evidence that Allah is real, that the Muslim God is real, and that Islam has some sort of divine favor, that there's something providential about Islam. This This is the only tangible sign, the fact that there were military victories. But if you're going to use that as a metric, then you're also going to have to say that Alexander the Great, was a prophet. And he was a much greater prophet than Muhammad, because by the time Alexander died, he hadn't just conquered one peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, he had conquered Persia, the heart of the civilized world, Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. He had conquered Babylon. He had stretched his empire all the way through what is now modern day Pakistan and India. So he'd conquered virtually the entire known world, the civilized world. He had conquered it all and actually established little, um, tetrarchs, like little governors that inherited his empire, and eventually it very rapidly dissolved upon his death. But he was a much greater military leader than Muhammad. So if you're going to say these military victories are evidence of, or an attestation of Muhammad's prophethood, you have to say the same thing about Alexander and say, well, Alexander was even more of a prophet than Muhammad. And you have to make the same case for Julius Caesar or Scipio, the great Roman general, Belisarius, the general under the Roman Emperor Justinian. You see how bizarre this notion gets. If the only thing that testifies to Muhammad's prophethood or to the divinity of Allah is the Muslim military victories, then that's a very, very weak argument, especially when you compare it to the proof, the ample proof provided in Scripture throughout the Bible. The most prominent being the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but also the ingathering of Israel, even for people who are skeptics, whose natural disposition is to doubt everything in the Bible. The fact that a dead nation and a dead language and a dead currency were all resurrected within a short period of time after Israel had been forsaken by the entire world. And in fact, there's a great travelogue by Mark Twain of his time in the Middle East, and the way he describes Israel mirrors the description of the plagues, the desolation that would befall Israel, as God describes it in Deuteronomy. If they did not obey God, this is what would happen. And his description of Israel at that time fits that those prophetic words to a T. And yet Israel was ingathered Jews throughout the entire world, and Israel was established as a modern state with Hebrew as its language, a currency, and a language, a nation that had not existed for nearly 2 millennia. So there is concrete evidence that the God of Israel exists, that Jesus was the Messiah. The existence of the church itself is an indication of the fact that Jesus was the Messiah. The fact that there were people who continued to believe and even die for Jesus after his death is a testament to the fact that he was resurrected, because he gave he gave testable claims. He said that he would be killed, be crucified, and then resurrect. And this is something that could be easily disproven. He did not give some nebulous sort of angelic encounter, which other false religions like Mormonism or Islam stake their their claim on. He did not give some nebulous angelic encounter which is unfalsifiable and can't be disproven or proven. He said, "I'm going to die and then I'm going to resurrect." If he had not resurrected, there would be no church. There would be no Christian church. There would be no followers of Jesus. Just like every other false religion led by someone who claims to be the Messiah ends almost always with that person's death, because he dies, because that person is a false prophet and just a human being, whereas Jesus was and is uh, the Son of God and Christ. So that's just to set the background for this chapter, uh, this surah, establishing the fact that this is the main claim for Islam, that Muslims actually are following the true God, the fact that Muslims enjoyed military success. But you have to ask yourself, even in that little narrow claim, Muhammad fails as a prophet, because the Muslims, this is the 21st century, and the Muslims have still not conquered Rome. They like to claim that the fact that Constantinople fell in the late 15th century and Rome had moved to the Eastern Empire, the civilization, literature, the the main guts of the empire had moved to the east, to Constantinople, and the fact that that fell is an indication that Muhammad was right. But Muhammad wasn't talking about Constantinople; he was talking about Rome, the Roman Empire. When people think of the Roman Empire, they think of Rome itself, the place where Paul was put to death and other apostles, the place where, after Constantine made Christianity legal with the Edict of Milan, where the church itself merged with the empire, where there was a political religious. That's what people think of when they think of Rome. And even in this narrow claim to the Quran's divinity, Muhammad fails that test, because it's the 21st century and Rome is not, as of yet, it hasn't been conquered by Muslims. So even there, it's demonstrable proof that the Quran is nonsense, and it's not inspired, and it's definitely not divinely created. So I'll just begin this chapter a little bit and continue it in another video, but it starts with, O Prophet, be careful of your duty to Allah and do not comply with the wishes of the unbelievers and the hypocrites. Surely Allah is knowing wise. And that word hypocrites is a recurring trope in the Quran, and it's important because Muslims like to attack takfiris, people who say this group isn't a Muslim, say ISIS or Al Qaeda, and on the other side you have more orthodox Muslims say that Ahmadis aren't Muslims, this and that, and it's basically practicing takfir. And you have certain, particularly liberal Western Muslims, castigating those who are takfiris, even though they too practice takfir whenever they say the Islamic State is not Muslim or Al Qaeda isn't Muslim. And Nabil Qureshi brought up this contradiction in his book, Answering Jihad. Nabil was one of the greatest apologists within, even though he was only an apologist for a little over a decade, he had such an impact on this world. And I would recommend reading his 3 books, but this was a great point he made in Answering Jihad, the fact that even the Muslims who condemn takfirism are practicing it themselves, when they want to distance Islam from less uh, less the less um, amenable parts of their religion, like beheading people or immolating people, even though those were both things that Muhammad and his followers did. So, but takfir dates all the way back. Some people like to say the first fitna or the battles after the Rashidun Caliphate, the first four caliphs, whom the Shiites would say the four rightly guided caliphs, and others would say the four rightly guided caliphs. And after the Rashidun Caliphate and Ali's assassination, the this is where the idea of takfir really gained prominence, and the Kharijites were a group that refused to accept the idea of any sort of mediation between Ali and Muawiyah, who were rival claimants to authority in the wake of this all happened after Muhammad's death. But this concept of takfir dates back even before the first fitna, before these wars. It can be traced back to Muhammad himself. So when he's condemning unbelievers and telling you not to comply with unbelievers, he doesn't just say unbelievers, in other words, Jews or Christians or pagan Arab tribes. He says, do not comply with the wishes of the unbelievers and the hypocrites. And by hypocrites, he's talking about people who, and he references this in other parts of the Quran, people who say they're Muslims but are not real Muslims. In other words, they're not following Muhammad's wishes. Therefore, they're not real Muslims. It's kind of a no true Scotsman fallacy, only this time applied to Islam. So, yeah, they may say they're Muslims, but they're not real Muslims. And you find this throughout the Quran, Muhammad condemning these people who are Muslims, but are not complying with Muhammad's wishes or not acting in accord with Muhammad's desires. So these people are grouped under the general rubric of hypocrites. And when he's saying these people are hypocrites, he's basically practicing takfir. So even though the concept did not become codified into after Muhammad's death, much later, he himself was practicing it when he's condemning hypocrites. That's what he's basically doing. So he's doing the same thing that Khalid Islambuli, the assassin of Anwar Sadat, did, and the Egyptian jihadist groups like Al Jihad and Egyptian Al Gamia Islamia. These groups that were led by Ayman al-Zawahiri and the blind sheikh. He's practicing the same thing that these groups did, all of these jihadi groups. And all of these people have a basis for doing what they're doing, because the basis is the Quran itself. So when you have some Islamic apologist, particularly in the West, in the UK or US, say that, oh, these takfiris, they're not practicing Islam, you can point to this chapter and the first verse, but also verses. The Quran is replete with these type of verses condemning hypocrites. So you can just point them here and say, no, Ayman al-Zawahiri and the late Osama bin Laden, people like him, they were justified in takfir according to your own holy book or one of your holy books. So, excuse me. It continues in 4. Allah has not made for any man two hearts within him, nor has he made your wives, whose backs you liken to the backs of your mothers, as your mothers. And that's bizarre. I'm not going to get into dissecting that weirdly constructed uh, clause, but it continues, nor has he made those whom you assert to be your sons your real sons. And this is great because Islam bans adoption. And even though technically you can take an orphan into your house and he can live there, and this is alluded to in different passages of the Quran, you can do that. You can't really adopt a son or adopt daughter. They won't be your real son or your real daughter. Even if you take them and they live in your house, they can never be your son. And this is probably one of the underappreciated aspects of Islam, one of the most uncommented upon but most vile parts of Islam. And David Wood brought this up and had an entire episode of Islamicize Me devoted to this subject, where Vocab Malone kicked his son out of the house. And it was amusing, but it was also very moving because it makes you realize how brutal Islam is and how antithetical it is to the message of Jesus, who said that the second greatest commandment was to love others as yourself after um, after loving God with all your heart and all your might, affirming the affirming the message of the Old Testament. He was saying the second commandment was to love your neighbor as yourself, and these are the two great commandments. And the entire corpus of the law is basically embodied in these two commandments. And Islam is the exact opposite, because and a lot of this has to do with Muhammad's own very traumatic childhood. The fact that his parents died very young, he was shuffled from one home to the next. He never had a maternal or a paternal bond. And the one relative he did develop a bond with, he was taken out of her house and shipped off. So he was basically, and it's hard to feel sympathy for Muhammad, but if you actually understand his background, you'll understand why he had some of these twisted ideas. So it's not as if Islam developed in a vacuum. A lot of the horrible aspects of Islam did stem from his own upbringing and the surrounding Arabian culture, which I don't want to glamorize. I mean, even though Islam institutionalized a lot of these horrific practices and beliefs, it's not as if it sprang from a pre-existing culture that was healthy. So the one of the reasons Islam forbids adoption as we conceive it, taking someone who has no parents and becoming their mother or their father. One of the reasons it prescribes that is because of Muhammad's own very sad background. And like a lot of Islam, it's Muhammad projecting his own disturbed ideas and upbringing onto the rest of the world, and using his alter ego, Allah, to institutionalize these horrible ideas. And it's in stark contrast to the Bible, and I'll just quote Galatians 4, beginning with verse 1. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the father. Even so, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because ye are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. So this is a great passage that illustrates the stark difference between Islam and Christianity, and the chasm between Christ and Muhammad. And I just wanted to end on that note. I would recommend anyone who gets the chance to talk to a Muslim. I know the Gospel of John is great to introduce to people who aren't really aware of the gospel, but there are some parts of the Bible that actually are really useful for Muslims, particularly Galatians, in destroying their false notions and these mental roadblocks, particularly the idea that God has no son. Allah has no son because Allah is not God. Allah is a projection of Muhammad, and Muhammad had a very traumatic upbringing and infused his religion with his own beliefs. But God does have a son, and in fact, he has many sons, because once we decide to believe on Jesus and accept, and he becomes our savior. Once that happens, we are all sons or daughters. So Galatians would be a great place, particularly Galatians 4, to start with, and destroying some of these false notions and the idea that people who have illnesses or diseases, that they're somehow cursed. The book of Job is also a great place to start with that, and there are other books that I'm going to mention when in future videos. But I just wanted to start that surah, and like I said, if you like this series, just feel free to share, and I'll see you next time to continue and hopefully finish up that surah.